Some stories begin with a crime. This one begins with a misunderstanding, one so small it should never have led to bloodshed. Two FBI agents set out on a quiet June morning to follow a lead about a stolen pair of boots, and drove straight into the deadliest ambush in modern federal law enforcement history. Within minutes, the prairie around the Jumping Bull property erupted. Hundreds of rounds fired, vehicles shredded, radios silenced. When the shooting stopped, Agents Ronald A. Williams and Jack R. Coler lay in an open field, unreachable, alone and gone long before help could reach them. What happened next would fracture the country for decades. A fugitive on the run across states and borders, a burned-out Suburban carrying the melted remains of the murder weapon, a sprawling manhunt that pulled in local police, federal agents, and the RCMP, trials shaped by politics, fear, and the shadow of Wounded Knee. Ballistic evidence that stood the test of half a century, and an appeals battle that became larger than the crime itself, turning one man into an icon, a symbol or a murderer, depending on who was telling the story. But beneath the arguments, protests, documentaries, and political campaigns, beneath the myths that grew over decades, remains a stark, unmovable truth. Two federal agents died in a 10-minute storm of gunfire. Someone walked away from that field. And the fight over what happened there has never truly ended. This is the story behind the headlines. The evidence, the flight, the trials, the decades of controversy, and the two men at the center of a case that still divides America almost 50 years later. A story where every detail matters, and where the answers once revealed, cut deeper than anyone expects. The heat rose early, over the hills surrounding the Pine Ridge Reservation. On June 26, 1975, pressing into every surface with a dry, unbroken weight, the prairie grass lay flattened in long swaths, where the wind had passed during the night, leaving behind a landscape that appeared motionless, except for distant shimmering bends of sunlight. The reservation roads stretched in pale, dusty lines that ran between scattered houses, ravines, and open fields. Each mile shared the same tension that had permeated the region for more than 2 years. The events at Wounded Knee had passed into history, but their consequences remained embedded in the daily life of Pine Ridge. Federal law enforcement, tribal police, and AIM adherents moved through the same spaces with an unease that shaped every encounter, every knock on a door, every quiet approach of a vehicle. The Rapid City Resident Agency had been responding to that tension for months, with additional manpower, shifting schedules, and assignments that filled every hour of the day. That morning, Special Agents Jack Coler and Ronald Williams had already been on the reservation once. Their efforts to locate and arrest Jimmy Eagle had pushed them across fields, into compounds, and along roads where few residents spoke openly, and many watched from a distance. Their work from the previous day had created a clear sequence of leads that needed to be checked, and both men understood the importance of completing that task. By late morning, they were in separate vehicles, each following the same route, with a rhythm formed by months of similar operations, turns or oncoming traffic. The landscape widened as they approached the Jumping Bull area, where the open ground made every movement visible against the backdrop of low hills. Williams kept scanning the terrain, narrowing his focus on anything that matched the description they had received the day before. The mention of a red vehicle had stayed with him, and he followed each possibility with measured caution. Coler maintained a position behind him, adjusting his speed whenever dust clouds or uneven ground required it. Overhead, the sky sharpened into a hard blue without clouds to diffuse the glare. Light reflected off the metal frames of both FBI vehicles, creating bright points as they entered each exposed stretch of land. Shortly before noon, the quiet changed. Williams identified a vehicle matching the general color pattern described earlier, a red and white Suburban moving ahead on the reservation road. The sight drew his attention with immediate clarity. The sequence of events built themselves in quick order as he adjusted his speed, narrowed the distance, and readied himself to initiate a stop. The Suburban continued through the open ground until it slowed, and eventually came to a halt in a space where the land spread in a wide arc on all sides. Williams approached, understanding the necessity of maintaining position while observing the occupants. Coler remained close behind, preparing to support whatever step came next. The stillness lasted only a moment before movement broke across the clearing. The Suburban's occupants emerged and took positions with weapons already raised. The first shots came with a suddenness that shifted the atmosphere instantly. Williams maneuvered for cover in the limited space available to him. Coler responded in tandem, choosing angles that allowed him to engage while assessing the growing threat. The air filled with the sharp impact of rounds hitting metal, glass, and earth. Dust rose in small bursts where bullets struck the ground near their vehicles. Each second became defined by the rapid escalation of fire coming from the Suburban's direction. Williams attempted to relay their position, while maintaining awareness of incoming fire. His vehicle, like Coler's, took repeated hits in quick succession. The Suburban's occupants continued firing without pause, forcing both agents into reactive movement as they tried to stabilize their defense. The ground around them offered little protection. The vehicles became their only barriers. Within moments, additional gunfire began arriving from a distance as individuals from the surrounding encampment moved toward the sound of the initial shots. The volume of fire increased beyond anything either agent could counter. Coler attempted to retrieve long guns from the trunk of his vehicle. As he opened it and reached for the weapons inside, a round struck his arm with catastrophic force, nearly severing it. The injury destabilized him immediately. Blood loss, shock, and the physical damage left him unable to continue the fight. Williams identified the severity of Coler's condition and attempted to reach him. The field between them was narrow, but the constant gunfire transformed those few steps into a deadly crossing. Williams moved toward Coler with urgency, using his own shirt to create a makeshift tourniquet around the injured arm. The fabric tightened under his hands as he worked to slow the bleeding, even as rounds continued to strike around them. Williams had already been hit by then. The rounds that entered his side, arm, and foot limited his mobility, but did not stop his efforts to keep both of them alive long enough for assistance to arrive. The two men remained behind the vehicles, as best they could, but the barrage of incoming fire made each position temporary and unstable. Their own weapons had been used only sparingly. Between them, only 5 rounds were fired during the entire confrontation, each one released under conditions that left little opportunity for further response. The attackers maintained overwhelming advantage from elevated and concealed positions across the field. The firefight continued for several minutes before falling into short lulls, followed by renewed bursts. During one of those brief gaps, Williams attempted again to report their situation. At that point, he likely recognized that their position had become indefensible. He knew they had both been injured, and the attackers were closing in. His transmission reached other agents, including Agent Gary Adams, who was racing toward the area at high speed. Adams attempted to approach but could not reach them due to sustained gunfire that forced him to halt, reposition, and withdraw behind cover. The silence that followed came without warning. The clearing shifted from the chaotic movement of active gunfire to the still tension of an unresolved scene. The attackers advanced toward the two agents' vehicles. Williams remained near Coler, injured, bleeding, but still capable of movement. His attempts to defend himself ended when the assailants reached close range. Physical evidence later established that Williams raised his right hand in a final defensive gesture. A bullet passed through that hand before entering his head, killing him instantly. Coler lay on the ground nearby, unconscious or near unconscious. He received one shot to the top of his head, followed by a second shot to the jaw that proved fatal. The attackers removed weapons from both agents, taking handguns and long guns from the scene. Williams' vehicle was driven away from its original position toward the location of the Suburban, and then toward the encampment area. Items were stripped from it, and forensic evidence later linked fingerprints on the interior door handle to one of the AIM associates. The attackers dispersed soon after, leaving the bodies where they fell. Agent Adams remained pinned down until additional law enforcement arrived. Sniper fire continued from distant positions, preventing immediate access to the bodies. Vehicles arriving throughout the afternoon also took rounds, forcing agents, tribal police, and Bureau of Indian Affairs officers to approach with extreme caution. The rescue and recovery efforts slowed under these conditions, extending the time before anyone could reach Coler and Williams. It was not until approximately 4:25 in the afternoon that the bodies of both agents were finally recovered. The scene presented a clear pattern of the final minutes. Coler positioned at the trunk of his vehicle with catastrophic arm trauma. Williams positioned beside him with injuries consistent with defensive actions, and both men ultimately killed by close-range shots. The vehicles bore the physical imprint of the attack. The total of 125 bullet holes did not include the rounds that passed through windows, struck the agents, or landed in the surrounding ground. The concentration of .223 shell casings scattered around the field and the single .223 casing inside the open trunk of Coler's vehicle formed the early foundation of the forensic investigation that followed. As evening settled over Pine Ridge, the reservation returned to an uneasy quiet, broken only by the movements of investigators documenting the scene. The sun lowered across the hills and threw long shadows over the clearing where the events had unfolded. The surrounding prairie, wide and unobstructed, emphasized how exposed Coler and Williams had been from the moment they initiated the vehicle stop. The attackers had controlled the high ground, the distance, and the momentum of the encounter. Vehicles parked along the approach roads remained damaged from the gunfire they encountered during the afternoon. The smell of burned rubber from blown tires lingered in the air. The investigators worked methodically, aware that the evidence they collected would determine the trajectory of the case in the months and years that followed. The scale of the attack, the number of shooters, and the clear execution-style killings established early conclusions that shaped the federal response. There was no ambiguity about the severity of the event or its consequences. The deaths of 2 federal agents under these circumstances required a comprehensive, uncompromising investigation. Night arrived fully, before the last teams cleared the area. The temperature dropped with the fading sunlight, leaving a stark contrast to the heat that had dominated the day. The two FBI vehicles remained where they had stood throughout the attack, their surfaces punctured by dozens of impacts. The open trunk of Coler's car, with the single .223 casing, still inside until it was later collected, formed a silent record of the last moments he experienced while reaching for his long guns. Williams' vehicle, having been driven and stripped, stood at a distance with its interior partially gutted. Both vehicles reflected the extent of violence inflicted in a span of minutes. The reservation itself remained tense. Word of the attack spread quickly across communities, raising questions, fears, and competing narratives before the investigation had even begun. The division between factions deepened, and the presence of federal agents increased. Every step taken on Pine Ridge in the days that followed carried the weight of the confrontation, the deaths, and the accelerating search for those responsible. The case that emerged from this single violent encounter would span states, involve multiple agencies, and ignite political disputes that lasted decades. The RESMURS case closed with the day's final aftermath. Two fallen agents, a crime scene stretching across open land, and the beginning of one of the most complex and controversial federal investigations of the era. The field where the confrontation occurred would remain a central point of reference for years, revisited through photographs, testimonies, forensic reports, and court proceedings. The precise location where the Suburban stopped, the distance between vehicles, the position of each shell casing, and the paths taken by the attackers all became fixed components of a case that would travel far beyond the boundaries of Pine Ridge. The events of June 26, 1975, were defined by speed, overwhelming firepower, and the isolation of two agents caught in circumstances they could not overcome. Their final actions, recorded through physical evidence rather than words, reflected training, professionalism, and the instinct to protect one another despite impossible odds. The radio transmission that marked the last moment of communication became the final fragment of their effort to survive. Everything that followed unfolded in the space between that transmission and the point at which the field fell silent. The day ended not with resolution, but with the knowledge that the investigation had only begun. The forensic patterns, the vehicle positions, and the eyewitness accounts formed the initial framework. The search for those who fired the shots moved into multiple states. The pursuit of suspects, the gathering of physical evidence, and the legal battles that emerged would stretch far beyond the isolated clearing where the confrontation took place. The land across the Pine Ridge Reservation, in the mid-1970s, carried a permanent tension shaped by years of political conflict, violence, and factional suspicion. 2 years had passed since the siege at Wounded Knee. Yet the aftermath remained present in every part of reservation life. Roads cut through wide stretches of open ground, where houses, trailers, and small compounds stood in isolated clusters. Residents moved cautiously, aware that the uneasy balance between the tribal government, AIM members, and traditionalists could shift at any moment. Federal authorities monitored the region constantly, responding to reports of assaults, weapon sightings, and criminal activity that reached levels far beyond what the area had experienced in earlier decades. By 1975, the Rapid City Resident Agency of the FBI carried an investigative load that would have strained even a much larger field office. With only 12 permanent agents and a surge of violence tied to internal political conflict on the reservation, 6 additional agents were assigned on temporary duty to assist. Among them was Special Agent Jack R. Coler, who arrived with the objective of reinforcing federal law enforcement capacity during a period of escalating instability. The pressure on the agency grew daily, as reports accumulated of shootings, beatings, armed confrontations, and incidents involving stolen weapons. Each case required swift attention, yet the vastness of Pine Ridge often turned rapid response into an impossible task. The agents adapted to the demanding pace, organizing their days around long stretches of driving, brief interviews, and near-continuous split-team coordination. Within the reservation community, loyalties were sharply divided. The tribal government maintained its authority through elected leadership and local law enforcement, while AIM supporters challenged the legitimacy of that authority with their own vision of political and cultural self-determination. Traditionalists aligned with AIM in many respects, but carried their own philosophies regarding the direction of reservation life. The result was a climate dominated by rivalries and mistrust. Into this environment entered Leonard Peltier and several AIM associates. They were not from Pine Ridge and had come to the reservation following an AIM gathering in Farmington, New Mexico. Their arrival added another unpredictable element to an already unstable situation. Peltier was subject to an outstanding federal warrant for unlawful flight to avoid prosecution for attempted murder of an off-duty police officer in Wisconsin. He also traveled with individuals who were armed and mobile, moving across the reservation and establishing a camp near the Jumping Bull property. In the months leading up to June, 1975. A series of burglaries occurred across the reservation, targeting homes where firearms were known to be stored. Testimony and investigative findings later linked some of these incidents to AIM members or associates of Peltier, although the full extent of involvement varied across accounts. One stolen weapon, a British .308 rifle, later appeared in the possession of AIM-aligned individuals and would become significant in reconstructing the events leading up to and following the murders of 2 federal agents. The increasing number of burglaries added further strain to the FBI's caseload and heightened the urgency of maintaining a continuous presence on Pine Ridge. The memory of Wounded Knee remained vivid among residents and law enforcement personnel alike. While the events of the occupation were not directly tied to the murders that would later occur, the political and social divisions created during that period continued to shape interactions among all parties. As the summer approached, the conditions on Pine Ridge grew increasingly volatile. Higher temperatures, longer daylight hours, and seasonal movement across the reservation contributed to an uptick in criminal reports. Armed individuals were seen moving between camps. Vehicles with unknown occupants traveled at irregular hours. Calls to tribal police and federal agents described escalating threats, intimidation attempts, and confrontations that required immediate response. The Rapid City Agency found itself constantly engaged, often with little time between one event and the next. The agents became accustomed to driving rapidly across long distances of open land, responding to calls as they came in, and preparing for situations where they might be outnumbered or caught in crossfire. Amid this environment, federal authorities focused on locating and arresting Jimmy Eagle, a young man wanted on federal charges of robbery and assault, with a deadly weapon for beating and robbing an individual on the reservation. A federal warrant had been issued for his arrest, and finding him became a priority. On June 25, 1975, agents Coler and Ronald Williams visited several locations across Pine Ridge in an effort to locate Eagle. Their search brought them to the Jumping Bull compound, where they encountered Norman Charles and 2 other individuals. The agents interviewed Charles inside Williams's vehicle, informing him of the reason for their presence. Charles stated that Eagle had recently left in a red vehicle. The information, although limited, gave the agents a specific lead to follow the next day. As the sun set that evening, the reservation quieted, but the underlying tension persisted. AIM-aligned individuals remained alert to federal movement. Camps positioned in areas with broad vantage points monitored traffic along the surrounding roads. The camp associated with Peltier maintained weapons, ammunition, and multiple vehicles, including the red and white Suburban later identified as the one Williams spotted. Every noise, every approaching vehicle, and every unfamiliar movement drew scrutiny from those stationed inside the encampment. In Rapid City, federal agents prepared for another full day of operations on June 26. Reports from the previous day were reviewed, notes were compared, and the search for Eagle was reassigned as a priority for Williams and Coler. The description of the red vehicle provided by Charles stood out as the most actionable lead. Both agents approached the next day's mission with the same diligence that had defined their work throughout their assignments. They were aware of the risks and familiar with the environment, but the day's operations appeared to be routine in nature. The search required persistent effort, careful observation, and adherence to procedure. The morning of June 26 began quietly. Williams and Coler traveled separately, but maintained communication, covering the same general areas they had surveyed the night before. The temperature rose quickly. Fields of prairie grass shimmered under the sunlight, and dust lifted behind each vehicle as they advanced along reservation roads. Few residents were outdoors due to the midday heat. Houses and small compounds appeared still, with only occasional movement visible in the distance. The silence created the illusion of calm, but the agents knew that activity within encampments and inside homes often occurred out of view. As Williams continued his search, his attention remained fixed on identifying any vehicle matching the red and white description associated with Eagle. Coler remained behind him, adjusting speed and distance as needed. He continued forward, prepared to approach any vehicle or individual that matched the information they had collected. Inside the AIM encampment, movement continued throughout the morning. Individuals traveled between vehicles, tents, and makeshift structures. Weapons were kept accessible, and surveillance of the surrounding terrain remained steady. The camp's occupants were aware that federal agents were active on the reservation and monitored the roads leading to and from the compound. The presence of law enforcement, though expected, was not welcomed. Tension within the encampment was heightened by recent events, ongoing disputes with the tribal government, and the general environment of confrontation that had come to define relations with federal authorities. The landscape surrounding the Jumping Bull area offered no concealment for approaching vehicles. The hills and open fields created long sight lines that revealed each vehicle long before it arrived. Williams and Coler advanced steadily, maintaining professional composure and readiness. Their movement was methodical, Consistent with standard investigative practice, they were not anticipating a major confrontation. Their mission remained the same: locate and arrest a fugitive wanted on a federal warrant. As midday approached, conditions aligned in a way that would soon lead to irreversible consequences. The red and white Suburban, associated with Peltier and his group, traveled test color pattern, matched the description Williams had received during his interview with Charles. It became immediately significant as it appeared on the road ahead. The atmosphere of the reservation, shaped by months of violence and mutual suspicion, was about to collapse into a direct confrontation. The setting was fully formed. The competing factions were in place. The geography of the reservation provided no protection for those who would soon become targets. The open fields, the isolated roads, and the encampment's proximity created a scenario where a single investigative action would intersect with armed individuals, determined to avoid any encounter with law enforcement. The agents remained focused on their assignment. The individuals in the Suburban remained alert to federal presence. The environment held its tension as both groups moved toward the point where the events of the day would begin. The reservation stands in its full complexity, politically divided, heavily armed, and shaped by the consequences of Wounded Knee. 2 federal agents advanced through that environment with purpose and professionalism. Several armed individuals observed their movements with a readiness shaped by months of conflict. The conditions on Pine Ridge have reached a critical point, and the consequences will reverberate across decades. Morning settled over Pine Ridge on June 26, 1975, with a hard, unwavering heat that signaled another difficult day for federal agents operating across the reservation. The land transitioned slowly from the coolness of dawn into a landscape defined by glare, rising temperatures, and a stillness that masked the underlying tension. Sparse vegetation cast short shadows over the uneven ground, and the quiet roads showed little indication of the activity that would soon unfold. Federal agents had begun their work early, reviewing leads carried over from the previous night. Among those preparing to continue the search for a federal fugitive were Special Agents Ronald Williams and Jack Coler. Their assignments had been steady for weeks, filled with movement between compounds, homes, and encampments where the presence of armed individuals made each step unpredictable. But Williams began moving through the reservation roads with the same focused attention he demonstrated on every assignment. His vehicle advanced at a measured pace as he scanned the terrain for anything that matched the information gathered from the previous day's interviews. The description of a red vehicle remained the central lead in the pursuit of Jimmy Eagle, whose whereabouts had not been confirmed despite extensive inquiry. Williams kept the description in mind as he traveled through stretches of open land and isolated residences. The quiet of the morning allowed details to stand out clearly against the landscape. Dust lifted behind his vehicle in soft plumes that settled quickly in the heavy air. Several miles behind him, Coler followed along the same path, maintaining visual awareness of the road ahead and adjusting his position based on turns, inclines, and the distance between them. Both agents were experienced in coordinating pursuits, and their movements reflected a practiced rhythm. The previous evening's encounter with Norman Charles had offered the first concrete lead. Eagle had left in a red vehicle. That detail alone justified returning to the same region where Charles had been encountered, knowing that fugitives often remained near familiar locations, even when avoiding detection. The early hours passed without incident. As Williams and Coler continued their methodical sweep, the reservation stretched endlessly in all directions, with large areas of open ground, providing little cover but wide visibility. Though the terrain appeared calm, underlying currents of tension persisted. The divisions between residents, tribal authorities, and AM allies remained sharp. On Pine Ridge, the presence of any federal vehicle carried implications that could ripple through various communities. In particular, the involvement of AM members created additional levels of complexity, as their camps moved frequently and maintained defensive awareness at all hours. The agents were familiar with this dynamic and approached their assignments accordingly. As the morning progressed, the AM encampment near the Jumping Bull compound became increasingly active. Individuals moved between tents, vehicles, and shaded areas where weapons were accessible and supplies were kept. The group's presence had been noted by residents and law enforcement alike, and the camp's location gave it a clear vantage point over the surrounding terrain. Paths leading from the encampment offered several routes for observation, retreat, or movement toward other compounds. Those present on the site monitored nearby roads carefully, especially those often used by federal agents. The group carried a range of rifles and ammunition. Among the weapons present was an AR-15, later established as belonging to Leonard Peltier, a weapon capable of firing .223 caliber rounds that would become central to the forensic analysis of the events that followed. While movement within the camp continued, the red and white Suburban associated with Peltier's group left the area and traveled along reservation roads. The vehicle carried individuals, whom federal investigators later identified as Peltier, Norman Charles, and Joe Stuntz. The Suburban contained weapons and other supplies, and those inside were aware of the ongoing federal search for Eagle. The roads surrounding the Jumping Bull region offered long lines of sight in every direction. Williams continued driving across the reservation, adjusting his speed whenever the road narrowed or dipped. He moved with controlled attention, observing the areas around him, and registering each possible match to the vehicle description. The atmosphere remained heavy under the midday heat. Dust settled rapidly after each pass, creating clear visibility across open fields. The environment appeared undisturbed, yet its silence was deceptive. Several minutes later, Williams identified a vehicle ahead that matched the red and white description, connected to Eagle. The site registered immediately. The sequence of investigative steps took shape with precision. Close the distance, observe the occupants, and determine whether the vehicle warranted a stop. His training guided him through each assessment, and the information gathered the previous day provided sufficient justification to monitor the vehicle more closely. The Suburban continued at a steady pace, moving through an exposed section of the reservation road, where the terrain offered no cover on either side. Coler, following behind Williams, adjusted his own speed in response, and maintained a position that allowed him to support whatever decision Williams made next. The clearing where the Suburban began to slow was wide and open, bordered by uneven ground and distant hills. Few structures stood near the road, creating an area where movement could be seen from all angles. The Suburban advanced a short distance further, before decelerating abruptly and coming to a full stop on a patch of open ground. Inside the vehicle, the individuals prepared to exit. Outside, the environment remained calm for a single moment that marked the final point of separation between pursuit and confrontation. Williams observed the Suburban's halt and prepared to initiate the next procedural step. He followed at a controlled pace, mindful of the terrain and the vehicle's positioning. Coler mirrored his movement, ready to provide immediate support. Neither agent had reason to anticipate a sudden escalation. Within the Suburban, the individuals prepared themselves for a drastically different response. The open ground offered them a wide defensive perimeter. The weapons available inside the vehicle were accessible within seconds. They did not intend to allow federal agents to carry out the arrest or investigative steps that would normally follow a vehicle stop. Their exit from the Suburban took place with purpose and speed, setting the conditions for an encounter that would unfold with devastating consequences. The two federal vehicles approached the clearing from behind, moving into a space that would soon become the site of overwhelming fire. The investigative lead that had guided Williams to the Suburban became the precise point at which the fatal sequence began. The movement of the Suburban's occupants, the weapons they carried, and the open terrain combined to create a situation where the approaching agents faced immediate, disproportionate danger. Federal agents operating in rural environments often relied on defensive positioning and rapid assessment of surroundings. On Pine Ridge, these skills were essential due to the large number of armed individuals scattered across the reservation. Nonetheless, the open landscape near the Jumping Bull area offered little opportunity for defensive maneuvering once the Suburban stopped. The nearest cover was limited to the vehicles themselves, and the attackers occupied ground that provided superior angles of fire. The imbalance in positioning became apparent only after the confrontation began, but by then, conditions had already shifted beyond the agent's ability to regain control. Williams advanced closer to the stationary vehicle, assessing its occupants through the windshield and side windows. The Suburban remained still on the clearing, but the lack of further movement from inside created a moment of uncertainty. The reservation's atmosphere, combined with the presence of individuals known to be armed and mobile, elevated that uncertainty into caution. Coler moved his own vehicle into a supportive position behind Williams. Both continued their approach with the professionalism expected in federal field operations. Their training prepared them for a range of outcomes, but nothing in their experience matched what was about to unfold. The pursuit had now reached its final point of transition. The confrontation was seconds away. The Suburban, the individuals inside it, the agents approaching from behind, and the open terrain surrounding them were all fixed in positions that would define the opening stage of the violent encounter. The federal agents maintained their responsibilities with steady focus. The individuals in the Suburban shifted fully into armed readiness. As the vehicles settled into their positions and the individuals in the Suburban prepared to exit, the next stage of events was set into irreversible motion. Pursuit had reached its endpoint. The elements were in place. The fatal minutes that followed were unavoidable, and the consequences would soon extend far beyond the boundaries of the reservation. The Suburban, however, carried occupants already prepared for a level of confrontation that exceeded anything the federal agents could have anticipated. Those inside had been monitoring federal activity for days. Their camp had kept weapons accessible, and the armed individuals traveling in the Suburban were accustomed to reacting quickly whenever law enforcement approached. The decision to stop the vehicle was not taken as a moment for compliance, but as a moment to transition directly into defensive violence. Their movements reflected the deep-seated hostility and tension that had permeated the reservation since the period following Wounded Knee. The doors of the Suburban opened. In rapid sequence, the individuals inside exited with weapons in hand, moving to positions along the vehicle and the surrounding terrain. Their actions displayed familiarity with armed engagement, rather than the hesitation expected from those suddenly confronted by law enforcement. The clearing offered a wide field of fire, and they took advantage of it immediately. Their positioning placed them at an elevation that allowed clear angles toward the approaching cars. The open environment turned the area into a natural funnel, and the agents' vehicles, still advancing, had not yet reached any point that could provide cover. The first gunfire erupted with abrupt force. The sound carried across the open land with a sharpness that cut through the still air. Bullets impacted the ground and the metal frames of the federal vehicles almost instantly, sending fragments and dust into sudden bursts. Williams responded instinctively, steering into a position intended to create a partial barrier, but the volume of fire overtook the situation in seconds. Coler, close behind, followed the same defensive impulse, but confronted the same overwhelming reality. The attackers controlled the ground, the angle, and the timing of the engagement. Within the first moments of the confrontation, the situation became increasingly perilous. The attackers demonstrated no hesitation, firing continuously as they moved along the Suburban and toward areas that provided them superior positioning. The agents remained confined to the limited protection their cars could offer. Williams stayed close to the front of his vehicle, while Coler attempted to adjust his own position to obtain access to the trunk where additional weapons were stored. The attackers maintained persistent fire, limiting the agents' ability to reposition or retreat. Despite the intensity of the barrage, the agents continued their efforts to respond within the constraints of the moment. Williams attempted to relay their position and the nature of the attack through radio communication. The urgency of his transmissions reflected the extreme conditions he faced. His attempts to communicate took place under constant threat, each second accompanied by rounds striking dangerously close. The sound of gunfire continued to drown out nearly everything else in the clearing. Coler, recognizing the severity of the situation, opened the trunk of his car to retrieve a long gun. As he reached inside, a round struck his arm, inflicting a catastrophic injury that rendered it nearly severed. The impact forced him backward. His ability to continue fighting immediately diminished. Blood loss and trauma made it impossible for him to stabilize himself. His attempt to access additional weapons ended abruptly, leaving him incapacitated in an exposed area behind the vehicle. Williams, already struck by rounds that impacted his foot, arm, and torso, remained mobile enough to reach Coler. The ground between them, though short in distance, had become a hazardous path under continuous fire. Williams crossed it with urgency, positioning himself next to Coler and assessing the damage. The condition of Coler's arm made clear that immediate action was required to slow the bleeding. Williams removed his own shirt and wrapped it tightly around the injured arm, creating a tourniquet while still attempting to maintain situational awareness. The attackers continued advancing, adjusting their positions around the edges of the clearing and firing with consistency. Their sustained aggression created a situation where the agents had minimal opportunity to respond, much less regain control. In the midst of the exchange, only 5 rounds were fired by the agents in total. Each shot represented an attempt to survive, rather than to turn the confrontation around. The disparity between the volume of fire from the attackers and the ability of the agents to respond demonstrated the overwhelming imbalance of the moment. Additional individuals from a nearby encampment soon moved toward the clearing after hearing the gunfire. The direction of their arrival added more pressure to the agents' already compromised position. The attackers continued firing from multiple directions, creating a dynamic and dangerous perimeter. Williams and Coler found themselves unable to move into safer positions, as the grass, vehicles, and open ground offered no additional protection from the incoming rounds. Minutes passed under relentless attack. The movement of the attackers created shifting arcs of fire, striking different parts of the vehicles and surrounding earth. Dust clouds formed repeatedly where rounds impacted, and the continuous strike of bullets against metal formed a grim percussion. The environment reflected the severity of the situation. Agents in exposed positions, vehicles covered in damage, and attackers in control of both movement and firepower. Williams attempted another radio transmission, providing directions for assisting agents and indicating the severity of their situation. His voice carried the urgency of someone aware that help was unlikely to arrive in time. His injuries were substantial, but he remained conscious and focused on both Coler's condition and the need to communicate their position. The gunfire around them continued to fall in heavy patterns, interspersed with slight pauses as attackers repositioned or reloaded. The attackers pushed closer, their presence forming a tightening perimeter around the agent's location. As Williams and Coler lay near their vehicles, the attackers reached a distance close enough to observe the agent's condition. With both agents incapacitated and no longer returning fire, the attackers moved in with an intent that would soon become clear through forensic evidence. Williams, despite his injuries, remained conscious when the attackers reached close range. His final effort to shield himself came through physical movement. He raised his right hand in an instinctive defensive attempt. A bullet passed through that hand before entering his head, causing instantaneous death. Coler lay nearby, unconscious or near unconscious, unable to react. A shot to the top of his head inflicted a severe injury, but did not immediately result in death. A second round to the jaw proved fatal. The sudden cessation of gunfire left the clearing in a stark silence, shaped by the outcome of the confrontation. The attackers moved through the area, removing weapons from the agents' bodies and vehicles. They took handguns and long guns, then repositioned Williams' vehicle, driving it closer to the Suburban, before eventually moving it toward the encampment, where it was stripped. The attackers dispersed soon after, leaving the scene without any attempt to hide the widespread evidence of the confrontation. The clearing, once silent and unbroken, now held the remains of the violent encounter. The vehicles were riddled with bullet holes, approximately 125 in total, not counting rounds that struck windows, glass, bodies, or the ground. Spent shell casings lay scattered across the field, with a large number of .223 casings concentrated in specific firing areas. The open trunk of Coler's car contained a single .223 casing that would later play a pivotal role in reconstructing the sequence of events. In the distance, federal and tribal law enforcement attempted to approach the area, but were met with renewed gunfire from unknown positions. Vehicles belonging to responding agents had their tires shot out as they attempted to access the clearing. The difficulty of securing the area delayed their arrival for several hours. The bodies of the agents remained unattended on the ground until late afternoon, when reinforcements finally established a secure perimeter. The environment slowly transitioned from active danger to investigative assessment as the afternoon wore on. The clearing bore all the signs of the sustained attack. Bullet impacts covered the vehicles. The surrounding grass and soil bore marks of heavy fire. Weapons had been removed, vehicles had been altered, and the bodies remained where the agents had fallen. The scene was one of overwhelming violence, shaped by the intensity of the attack and the conditions that offered the agents almost no opportunity for survival. As the day progressed, the clearing stood as a stark record of the confrontation. The evidence left behind, the casings, the bullet holes, the final positions of the agents, formed the basis for forensic analysis that would later establish the sequence with clarity. The attackers' control over the confrontation had been absolute. The agents' ability to respond had been overwhelmed in minutes. What began as an investigative pursuit ended in a violent exchange that would become one of the most scrutinized incidents in modern federal law enforcement history. The clearing where the confrontation had taken place fell into a heavy silence after the armed individuals withdrew, leaving behind a scene marked by devastation and immobility. The landscape, which had been still earlier that morning, now carried visible signs of the attack. Bullet holes covered the surfaces of both federal vehicles, forming an irregular pattern that reflected the ferocity of the sustained gunfire. The dry grass and dirt around the vehicles showed scattered impressions left by impacts, footprints, and sudden movements. The contrast between the earlier calm and the aftermath of the confrontation underscored how violently the sequence had unfolded. The two bodies lying beside the cars remained untouched for hours, exposed to the heat and dust, as law enforcement attempted to reach them through hostile terrain. Reservation's landscape amplified the danger. The open fields around the Jumping Bull area created expansive sightlines that allowed attackers to monitor movements from long distances. Law enforcement vehicles approaching from different directions appeared as moving targets across the exposed terrain. The lack of immediate concealment or protective cover made every advance vulnerable. The attackers' earlier movements indicated they were familiar with the defensive advantages in the area, allowing them to engage from positions difficult for law enforcement to counter without significant support. While agents held their positions at a distance, the situation began to stabilize gradually as reinforcements arrived from Rapid City and other nearby locations. The presence of additional personnel allowed for more coordinated planning. Tactical decisions centered on establishing observation points to identify possible sniper positions and assessing the safest route to access the clearing. Agents worked methodically, advancing in small increments, while monitoring the hills and terrain for any sign of movement. The goal was to reach the bodies and secure the scene, but the risk of renewed gunfire required a cautious and deliberate approach. As the afternoon progressed and the threat of sniper fire decreased, law enforcement began moving toward the clearing in a controlled manner. The silence that eventually settled over the area signaled a shift. By approximately 4:25 p.m., agents reached the bodies of Williams and Coler for the first time. The scene presented an immediate and striking record of what had taken place earlier. The positions of the bodies, the extensive damage to the vehicles, and the expended shell casings scattered across the ground formed a detailed visual outline of the sequence of events that had occurred. The body of Williams lay near the front of Coler's vehicle. His injuries reflected both the firefight and the close-range shots that ended his life. The wound through his right hand, and the fatal head wound aligned with forensic conclusions that he had attempted to shield himself during the final moments. His earlier injuries, including gunshot wounds to the foot, side, and arm, indicated he had fought to remain mobile throughout the confrontation. The body of Coler lay close by, positioned near the open trunk of his car. His nearly severed arm showed the point at which he had been incapacitated. The additional close-range wounds to his head documented the final actions of the attackers. As the initial recovery continued, law enforcement formed a perimeter around the site to secure the evidence from disturbance. The reservation remained on edge. News of the attack spread quickly through the communities. Individuals aligned with different factions reacted with anxiety, anger, or apprehension. Law enforcement prepared for the possibility of additional conflict. Knowing the region had experienced repeated cycles of violence in the preceding months, agents maintained heightened vigilance while processing the scene, aware that the attackers who had fled the area earlier might still be nearby. By early evening, specialized teams arrived to begin a more detailed forensic examination. They documented the bullet trajectories, the spatial arrangement of the vehicles, and the patterns formed by blood, glass, and debris. The positions of the bodies, which had been recorded before removal, became central to reconstructing the final movements of the agents. Every visible element was measured and photographed to ensure accuracy. In later analysis, the clearing transformed into a forensic grid, with markers placed through the area to indicate points of impact, casing locations, and directional movement. The broader reservation environment continued to shift as word of the killing circulated. Federal authorities prepared for a large-scale response, recognizing that the deliberate killing of 2 federal agents represented an unprecedented escalation. The FBI began mobilizing resources across multiple states. Additional personnel were reassigned to Pine Ridge. Command centers were prepared for intensified operations. The situation required coordination not only for the immediate investigation, but also for tracking suspects across wide distances and through multiple jurisdictions. Back at the scene, agents completed the initial documentation and recovery procedures. Williams and Coler were transported from the clearing with solemn precision, marking the formal beginning of the investigation. Their deaths represented not only a loss to the agency, but also a turning point that would redefine federal operations on Pine Ridge for months and years to come. The physical evidence collected at the scene, including weapons fragments, casings, fingerprints, vehicle damage, and blood patterns, formed the core of what would later become an extensive case file. As night descended over the reservation, the clearing took on a stark, almost static appearance. The heat of the day subsided, but the ground remained warm from the hours of direct exposure. The vehicles stood motionless in the fading light, their surfaces reflecting the extensive damage inflicted earlier. The dust settled across the area, and the earlier noise of gunfire had long since faded. In the quiet darkness, the first stage of the investigation had closed, but the sense of gravity surrounding the event only deepened. The shocking nature of the killings reverberated far beyond Pine Ridge. The deliberate killing of 2 federal agents during a lawful duty triggered an expansive response from the FBI. The agency mobilized investigative teams, forensic specialists, tactical units, and field agents from multiple divisions. The investigation's scope expanded at once, encompassing not only the immediate crime scene, but also the movements of AM members, associates, and individuals connected to the suburban involved in the confrontation. The clearing itself became the fixed point from which all investigative threads extended. Its physical evidence formed the baseline of the case. Its layout dictated the sequence of events. Its position in the reservation revealed the geographic challenges that shaped the confrontation. Each detail, recovered from the scene, contributed to the construction of a precise narrative that would later be presented in federal court. As the days progressed, the reservation witnessed shifts in movement among various individuals aligned with AM. Some departed quickly, while others remained but moved cautiously. The evidence recovered in the clearing grew in significance as investigators began connecting it to actions taken in the hours and days following the murders. Items recovered in vehicle explosions, abandoned houses, and arrests made in different states began to align with the initial physical findings. By the end of the first week, the foundation of the case had solidified around the evidence recovered in the clearing. The trajectory of rounds, the positions of the bodies, the shell casings, the weapon damage, and the forensic patterns all aligned into a consistent structure. The events of June 26 had unfolded with rapid brutality, leaving a scene that, though chaotic in appearance, contained precise indicators of what had occurred. Law enforcement had been outmaneuvered and overwhelmed in minutes. But the investigation that followed gained clarity through the thorough documentation of the area. As federal agents expanded their reach beyond the clearing, the investigation moved into a larger phase, involving interstate coordination, forensic analysis, witness interviews, and tracking of suspects. The clearing remained preserved in photographs and reports, but its transformation into a fully processed crime scene marked the transition from immediate response to a long-term investigative undertaking. The events that had taken place on the ground that day became the catalyst for one of the most wide-ranging federal pursuits of the era. The clearing stood as both the beginning and the anchor of everything that followed. Its silence in the aftermath belied the magnitude of the case that would emerge from the evidence collected there. The consequences of the confrontation would grow far beyond the boundaries of the reservation, extending into multiple states, courts, and decades of legal proceedings. The investigation moved into its next phase, the moment agents finished documenting the clearing and transporting the bodies of Williams and Coler. The initial shock of the killings gave way to an operational urgency that extended across multiple federal districts. The FBI began coordinating resources before nightfall, mobilizing personnel who could support a pursuit expected to stretch across state lines. Agents in Rapid City, Minneapolis, Denver, and other field divisions received immediate instructions to relocate or increase staffing. The deliberate killing of 2 agents during the performance of duty demanded a nationwide response, and the agency moved rapidly to establish a framework for a large-scale manhunt. Command posts were expanded, communication channels were streamlined, and field offices reallocated resources to ensure that investigators could track suspects across the region without delay. Information from the crime scene and early witness interviews established a clear starting point. Individuals associated with the American Indian movement had been present in the area at the time of the confrontation, and the red and white Suburban linked to Peltier became the primary focus. Witnesses confirmed that those who engaged the agents had fled immediately afterward, splitting into several smaller groups. The forensic evidence recovered from the clearing, including the .223 shell casing in the trunk of Coler's vehicle, and the casings scattered throughout the firing zone, provided an initial technical record. Investigators now needed to identify the movements of the individuals associated with the weapon that fired those rounds. The casing with unique extractor markings, later matched to the AR-15 recovered in Kansas, created a direct physical connection between the scene of the murders and the individuals who abandoned the burned vehicle. This connection became the nucleus of the pursuit that unfolded. In the hours following the murders, law enforcement activity across Pine Ridge intensified. Checkpoints were established at key roadways, and agents began sweeping areas known to serve as shelters or temporary encampments for AM members. The terrain, with its wide expanses and complex mix of open fields, wooded areas, and scattered structures, required both air and ground surveillance. Helicopters were deployed to cover large portions of the reservation, identifying vehicle tracks, disrupted grass, or signs of recent movement. Ground teams collected tire impressions, footprints, and discarded items from trails suspected to be used by fleeing suspects. The priority was to establish the direction in which the groups had dispersed immediately after the confrontation. By the next day, investigators had identified the initial departure route taken by several of the suspects, including the individuals in the Suburban. Agents located tracks leading away from the Jumping Bull area and followed them toward more heavily wooded sections of the reservation. These areas concealed movement effectively, allowing suspects to pass through undetected unless law enforcement tracked them carefully. The search teams followed the terrain through ravines, wooded edges, and narrow passes, documenting signs of recent travel. Footprint clusters, cigarette remnants, and spent casings found along lesser-used trails suggested that the suspects had continued carrying weapons after leaving the clearing. Throughout the reservation, tensions rose as agents questioned individuals who might have seen or assisted the group. Some residents provided information about observed movements, while others remained silent, unwilling to involve themselves in federal matters. Agents had to evaluate which leads were reliable and which were misdirection. Each report required verification, and the volume of information increased rapidly. The process demanded a careful separation of fact from speculation. The instability within the community further complicated the landscape. The divides between AIM members, traditionalists, and supporters of the tribal government influenced interactions with federal agents, and investigators adapted to these dynamics as they worked to gather usable intelligence. While agents combed the reservation, federal offices in surrounding states monitored reports of suspicious vehicles and movements associated with known AIM members. The inquiry expanded beyond South Dakota, as early intelligence suggested that the suspects had divided themselves into different directions after leaving the area. Some reports indicated movement toward Wyoming, Montana, or the Dakotas, while others pointed toward Colorado and the Southwest. Federal agents began coordinating with local sheriffs, state troopers, and other jurisdictions to flag vehicle descriptions matching those used by the suspects. The AR-15 and other weapons stolen from the reservation remained a critical concern, as any future confrontation involving them could result in additional casualties. On September 5th, 2 months after the murders, investigators recovered Agent Williams's handgun and spent casings from both agents' weapons in a vehicle associated with Darrell Butler. The location and timing of the discovery helped narrow the movements of specific suspects and created a clear picture of which individuals were in possession of federal property after the killings. The vehicle's interior contained additional items tied to AIM members, indicating ongoing mobility and shifting safe locations. Investigators documented the recovery carefully, adding it to the expanding body of evidence linking multiple individuals to the site of the killings and the flight afterward. Meanwhile, investigators continued tracking Peltier himself. Intelligence confirmed that he had purchased a Plymouth station wagon in Denver on September 9th. He then began traveling in a recreational vehicle, accompanied by associates using the newly acquired Plymouth. With the description of both vehicles distributed across law enforcement networks, an Oregon state trooper identified the RV and initiated a stop. The confrontation that followed demonstrated that Peltier remained armed and prepared to use deadly force. As soon as the trooper approached, Peltier exited the RV with a weapon and fired, forcing the trooper to retreat. The RV was later searched, and investigators found Agent Coler's handgun inside a bag positioned under the front seat, bearing Peltier's fingerprint. This recovery further consolidated the evidence tying Peltier to the weapons stolen from the murdered agents. The fact that he continued traveling while heavily armed, carrying weapons with obliterated serial numbers, aligned with the forensic findings from the scene of the explosion in Kansas. The manhunt expanded into Canada when information suggested that Peltier had crossed the border into Hinton, Alberta. The region included isolated areas where fugitives could remain hidden, with the assistance of sympathetic individuals. Canadian authorities coordinated closely with the FBI to pursue leads on Peltier's location. On February 6, 1976, the Royal Canadian Mounted Police located Peltier in a cabin on the reservation in Hinton. The arrest required careful coordination due to the expectation that Peltier remained heavily armed. When the RCMP entered the cabin, they found him in possession of numerous loaded weapons, confirming their assessment. After being taken into custody, Peltier made statements acknowledging knowledge of the murders, including a reference to 2 FBI agents being shot during an attempt to serve him with a warrant. These statements became relevant during later legal proceedings, focused on extradition and admissibility of evidence. Following the arrest, attention shifted to preparing the extradition request. The United States submitted evidence to Canadian authorities, demonstrating probable cause that Peltier had participated directly in the murders. Among the materials included were sworn affidavits from Myrtle Pourbaix, who claimed involvement or knowledge of Peltier's actions. Although her later statements and her exclusion from testifying at trial would reduce the relevance of these affidavits in subsequent judicial phases, they played a role in the initial extradition proceedings. Canadian courts examined the presented evidence, including ballistic analysis, witness testimony, and the forensic match between the AR-15 and the shell casing recovered on Pine Ridge. Once extradited, Peltier was placed in federal custody in the United States, where preparations began for a trial expected to attract national attention. Federal prosecutors assembled the extensive body of evidence collected over months of investigation. This included forensic reports, recovered weapons, ballistic matches, witness statements, and the sequence of events reconstructed from the scene of the murders. The prosecution's case relied heavily on the objective physical evidence that placed the murder weapon in Peltier's possession. The large quantity of ammunition and weapons found with him and his associates further contextualized the violent nature of their actions and the threat posed during their flight. Investigators continued to interview individuals connected with AIM, including those present at the reservation on the day of the murders. Some witnesses confirmed Peltier's possession of the AR-15. Others described his presence at the crime scene and his movements immediately afterward. The diversity of evidence, drawn from different locations and recovered under different circumstances, formed a cohesive narrative that positioned Peltier as central to the events of June 26. The forensic links, particularly the unmatched extractor marking on the .223 casing from the trunk, became the focal point of the case due to their reliability, clarity, and precision. In the months leading up to the trial, federal agents reviewed every aspect of the investigation to ensure the integrity of the evidence presented. The chain of custody for weapons, casings, and forensic materials was verified repeatedly. Reports from the FBI laboratory were re-examined to confirm that the conclusions remained consistent and supported by physical records. Each investigator involved in the recovery of evidence provided documentation and testimony, outlining the process used to collect and preserve items from the crime scene, the burned vehicle in Kansas, and the recreational vehicle in Oregon. The broader context of the crime, including the tensions on the Pine Ridge Reservation, the escalation of violence between factions, and the presence of AM members from outside the region, formed the background for understanding the events. However, the case against Peltier remained firmly anchored in the physical and forensic evidence, tying him to the weapon that fired the fatal shots. The recovery of Agent Coler's handgun in his recreational vehicle, the discovery of the AR-15 tied to the killings in the burned-out station wagon, and the ballistic match connecting those items to the scene of the murders formed the foundation on which prosecutors built their argument. By early 1977, the manhunt phase had transitioned entirely into the trial phase. The suspects who had participated in the attack had scattered across multiple states and communities. But the investigative process had tracked their movements, collected evidence from each stage, and assembled a comprehensive record of their actions. Each piece of physical evidence recovered during the manhunt returned to the same central conclusion. The AR-15 associated with Peltier had fired the fatal shots at close range, and his possession of weapons stolen from the agents after the killings solidified the connection. The transition from the manhunt phase to the legal phase required the FBI and federal prosecutors to reframe months of field operations into a structured case capable of withstanding intense judicial scrutiny. Every recovered casing, every bullet trajectory, every fragment from the burned Kansas vehicle, and every report from the crime scene needed to be cataloged, authenticated, and prepared for federal court presentation. The murders of Agents Ronald Williams and Jack Coler were no longer confined to the clearing on Pine Ridge or the series of interstate chases that followed. They had now entered a phase where facts would be weighed against defenses, procedures would be examined with precision, and the full evidentiary record would undergo detailed inspection. The agencies involved began consolidating their resources, reviewing the chain of custody for each piece of evidence, and preparing the outlines of a prosecution strategy grounded in forensic certainty. The legal proceedings would not be simple. They would involve political atmospheres, the historical complexities of Pine Ridge, and the defense's attempts to recast the narrative. Yet the core of the case, built on tangible evidence, remained stable. As the trial approached, the government assembled a comprehensive presentation of the forensic chain. The ballistic evidence formed the nucleus. The single .22-3 casing, recovered from the trunk of Coler's car, bore extractor markings that were unique and identifiable. Forensic analysis demonstrated that this casing had been extracted from the AR-15 recovered in the burned station wagon in Kansas. The same weapon had fired more than 100 .22-3 casings recovered from the wider firing zone at the murder scene. The technical match remained undisputed through every stage of judicial review. Prosecutors prepared to establish, through expert testimony, how extractor markings occur, how they are compared, and why they serve as reliable indicators of a weapon's identity. This evidence provided the strongest objective link, tying Peltier to the fatal shots delivered at close range. Beyond the ballistic findings, prosecutors prepared to introduce evidence showing that weapons belonging to the murdered agents were found in Peltier's possession after the murders. Agent Coler's handgun, recovered from the RV, stopped by the Oregon State Trooper, bore Peltier's fingerprint on the bag in which it had been stored. The AR-15 and Agent Coler's .308 rifle, found amid the debris of the Kansas explosion, allowed prosecutors to build a continuous chain from the clearing on Pine Ridge to the later movements of Peltier's associates. The discovery of multiple weapons with obliterated serial numbers further underscored the fugitives' operational mindset during their flight. Witness testimony added additional layers to the case. Michael Anderson, once located, would testify that Peltier's Suburban had arrived first at the scene, followed by the federal vehicles. He would confirm that Peltier, Charles, and Stuntz exited the Suburban armed and ready. Angie Long, visitor, would testify that FBI vehicles were easily identifiable on the reservation, and that only FBI personnel used cars of that type. These accounts reinforced the government's argument that the agents' identities were known and unmistakable. Testimony from other reservation residents further helped establish movement patterns, the presence of weapons, and the actions taken after the murders. The environment in Fargo remained controlled and procedural as the trial approached. Security at the courthouse intensified due to the attention the case had drawn. Media personnel were kept outside the primary areas of operation under the gag order. Observers understood the significance of the proceedings. 2 federal agents had been killed at close range, their weapons stolen, and the suspects had traveled across multiple states, while heavily armed. The case against Peltier became the centerpiece of a national conversation about violence on reservations, the American Indian movement, and the role of federal law enforcement. As jury selection began, prosecutors exercised considerable care in evaluating prospective jurors. The court granted the defense nearly twice the typical number of peremptory challenges, ensuring that the final panel represented a balanced selection. The sequestered nature of the jury provided a barrier against outside influence, while restrictions on public commentary and media interaction allowed the courtroom to remain focused strictly on the presentation of evidence. Every step in the pretrial phase reflected the government's intent to avoid the complexities that had affected the earlier Cedar Rapids trial. Once the arrangement of the prosecution's case was finalized, The sequence of presentation was clear. First, establish the physical setting of the crime. Second, demonstrate the volume and direction of gunfire, including the limited shots fired by the agents. Third, introduce the ballistic analysis linking the .223 casing in Coler's trunk to Peltier's AR-15. Fourth, detail the recovery of weapons from the Kansas explosion and the Oregon RV stop. Fifth, provide witness testimony placing Peltier in possession of the AR-15 during the murders. Sixth, describe the broader movements of Peltier's associates and the weapons stolen from the agents. This structured approach offered a direct linear progression from the morning of June 26 to the forensic conclusions that followed. The defense prepared to challenge the credibility of witness testimony, question the handling of evidence, and suggest alternative interpretations of events. They emphasized that others had been present and firing weapons that day, and they sought to introduce broader narratives concerning reservation conflict and federal presence. However, pretrial rulings ensured that the trial's central focus would remain tightly fixed on the evidence directly tied to Peltier's actions. As the trial date approached, prosecutors and investigators conducted final reviews of every report, chain of custody document, and forensic file. Agents involved in collecting evidence revisited their statements to confirm accuracy. Laboratory personnel prepared to explain the fine details of ballistic comparison. Investigators who had recovered weapons after the Kansas explosion and the Oregon RV stop prepared to describe the circumstances that led to the discoveries. The purpose was not only to present evidence, but to make certain that each connection held up against examination. The path to trial represented the culmination of an extensive and coordinated national effort. It united forensic science, investigative fieldwork, interstate operations, and international extradition. The broader political conflicts on Pine Ridge had influenced public perception, but the government's case rested on physical markers that could not be easily dismissed. The extractor markings on the .223 casing, the discovery of Agent Coler's handgun with Peltier's fingerprint, the burned AR-15 recovered in Kansas, and the movements of the suspects in the weeks following the murders. As the final preparations concluded, the stage was set for a judicial examination of the facts that had emerged since June 26, 1975. The killings of Williams and Coler had initiated a sequence of events that expanded far beyond the reservation. Now the assembled evidence would move into the courtroom, where it would be tested under federal law. The boundaries of the next phase were defined not by the terrain of Pine Ridge or the interstate routes of the manhunt, but by the structured environment of a federal trial. Everything that followed would determine how the events at the clearing would be legally understood for decades to come. The trial opened under strict conditions intended to maintain order, neutrality, and focus. By the time proceedings began, the courtroom in Fargo had been transformed into the central arena for one of the most consequential federal cases of the decade. Security remained tight, with controlled access to hallways, limited entry for observers, and clear separation between media and the judicial process. The sequestered jury had already been isolated from external influences, ensuring that their impressions would come only from the evidence presented inside the courtroom. The presiding judge, aware of the high stakes and the challenges of trying a case with such political and historical weight, enforced a disciplined structure from the first session. Attorneys operated under a gag order, eliminating the possibility of manipulating public opinion during the proceedings. The courtroom setting established a controlled environment in sharp contrast to the uncertainties that had characterized earlier phases of the investigation. Witness testimony further supported the technical evidence. Residents familiar with Pine Ridge testified that FBI vehicles were distinct and easily recognizable, countering any claim that the individuals firing at the agents did not know whom they were shooting at. Michael Anderson's testimony placed Peltier's Suburban at the scene before the federal vehicles arrived. He described the sequence in which the Suburban came to a stop, and its occupants exited with weapons. His testimony indicated that Peltier, Charles, and Stuntz were armed and positioned themselves to initiate gunfire. The jurors followed along with photographic reproductions of the clearing, as Anderson identified key spatial relationships. His statements reinforced the prosecution's narrative that the agents had been ambushed, unable to escape the decisively superior firepower aimed at them. The prosecution next introduced evidence recovered after the murders, including Agent Coler's handgun, found in the Oregon recreational vehicle stop. Investigators testified about the discovery of the handgun inside a bag located under the vehicle's front seat. The presence of Peltier's fingerprint on the bag connected him directly to the weapon stolen from the agent's body. This tangible link, combined with the ballistic evidence, helped establish the continuity of possession between the murders and the later movements of Peltier and his associates. The prosecution emphasized that weapons belonging to the agents had traveled with the suspects as they moved across multiple states and into Canada. The Kansas explosion formed another major component of the government's case. Agents testified about responding to the scene where the station wagon had erupted in flames due to the ignition of explosives carried inside it. The debris field recovered contained multiple weapons, ammunition, and bomb-making materials. Among the remains was Peltier's burned AR-15. Experts explained how even a damaged weapon could provide identifiable tool markings on casings, including extractor impressions. The jurors reviewed photographs of the burned vehicle, the recovered weapons, and the ammunition. They learned how the forensic team analyzed the AR-15, despite the fire damage, and confirmed that the weapon's extractor marks matched those found on the casing in Coler's trunk. The defense team entered the trial with a different strategy than the one used in Cedar Rapids. Without the benefit of broad historical testimony or references to reservation conflicts, they focused on undermining specific evidence. They questioned the handling of casings, suggesting potential contamination or misidentification, and attempted to cast doubt on the reliability of forensic processes. They highlighted inconsistencies in witness recollections and scrutinized government reports for procedural errors. However, the tight structure of the trial limited the defense's ability to introduce broader political narratives. The judge required that all evidence be directly relevant to establishing guilt or innocence. As a result, the defense was forced to operate within defined boundaries that prevented speculative diversions. Despite the defense's efforts, the prosecution's evidence presented a cohesive and linear narrative difficult to dismantle. Jurors observed that the technical findings did not depend on witness credibility, but instead relied on objective scientific markers. The ballistic match between the casing in Coler's trunk and Peltier's AR-15 stood as the pivotal point. Even the defense acknowledged the presence of the weapon in Kansas, where it was found with Peltier's closest associates. Their attempts to suggest that someone else might have used the weapon did not align with testimony, placing Peltier in possession of the AR-15 during the confrontation. Additional evidence showed that Peltier traveled with weapons bearing obliterated serial numbers, further indicating efforts to conceal ownership and usage. The prosecution continued its methodical presentation by introducing evidence related to the recreational vehicle stop in Oregon. Agents described the circumstances under which Peltier fired at the Oregon State Trooper, demonstrating a pattern of armed resistance during attempts to apprehend him. The discovery of Agent Coler's handgun within the vehicle reinforced the prosecution's claim that Peltier maintained possession of weapons stolen directly from the agents after the murders. Photographs of the weapon, along with fingerprint analysis, were displayed for the jury. These items complemented the ballistic findings and placed Peltier at the center of all major movements involving the stolen weapons. The trial progressed through weeks of structured testimony. Each day brought detailed accounts from investigators, forensic analysts, and reservation residents who had observed key events. The prosecution constructed a sequential timeline from the morning of June 26 to the capture of Peltier in Canada months later. The jury saw records of travel patterns, recovered weapons, and explosive materials carried by the suspects. They learned how investigators traced the movements of individuals who had participated in the attack. They examined photographs showing the aftermath of the firefight, the bullet-riddled vehicles, and the positions of the agents' bodies. The defense attempted to introduce the argument that the government had altered its theory of the case by suggesting, at times, that Peltier had fired the fatal shots, and, at other times, that he had aided and abetted the murders. The prosecution responded by clarifying that Peltier had been charged under Title 18, Section 2, which allowed for both direct participation and aiding and abetting liability. The jury instructions made clear that the charges encompassed full responsibility for the murders regardless of whether Peltier had pulled the trigger himself or had acted with others in furtherance of the attack. The defense's attempt to create ambiguity in the government's position did not alter the physical evidence, linking Peltier to the weapon used to execute the agents. Throughout the trial, the sequestered jury remained shielded from external pressures, media coverage, and political commentary. Their exposure to the case came solely through the courtroom presentations and the structured progression of evidence. The disciplined conduct of the proceedings ensured that the trial remained focused on the events of June 26 and the forensic and investigative findings that followed. The intense public attention surrounding the case did not penetrate the courtroom's controlled environment. As the prosecution concluded its case, the courtroom had been saturated with forensic, photographic, testimonial, and investigative evidence forming a comprehensive narrative of the murders. The sequence was consistent and supported across multiple sources. The clearing on Pine Ridge had been the opening stage. The Kansas explosion had been the confirmation stage. The Oregon RV stop had been the linking stage. The arrest in Canada had been the final stage of apprehension. Each event aligned with the others, closing gaps that might otherwise have remained open. When the defense presented its closing efforts, it did so within the narrow boundaries available. Without the ability to invoke broader political narratives, or to undermine the core forensics, the defense's strategy centered on questioning procedural elements and suggesting alternative interpretations that lacked substantive support. They aimed to create doubt, but the central forensic connections remained intact. The jurors had seen the evidence directly. They had reviewed photographic enlargements of extractor markings, They had read reports documenting the recovery of weapons. They had heard testimony from individuals, placing Peltier in possession of the AR-15 and the agent's stolen handguns. The consistency across these elements provided a unified structure that the defense could not dismantle. As the courtroom prepared to move into the final phase of the trial, the atmosphere grew more solemn. The proceedings had documented in precise detail the violent events that had claimed the lives of 2 federal agents. The next stage would involve final arguments that summarized months of investigation and weeks of testimony. The jurors would soon be asked to weigh the assembled evidence and determine whether it met the legal threshold for guilt. The clarity of the prosecution's case and the structure of the trial suggested that the jury would rely heavily on the forensic record, which had formed the backbone of the courtroom battle. The courtroom entered a phase of finality as both sides prepared for the concluding steps of the trial. Weeks of testimony, forensic demonstrations, investigative summaries, and carefully structured evidence had drawn the case into its final arc. The sequestered jury, isolated throughout the proceedings, had absorbed a vast amount of information. Photographs of the clearing, ballistic comparisons, forensic diagrams, eyewitness accounts, and testimony establishing the movements of Leonard Peltier and his associates. The environment inside the courtroom reflected a growing recognition that the next phase would determine how the events of June 26, 1975, would be judged under federal law. The attorneys reviewed their materials with the full understanding that the final arguments would frame the evidence the jury would take into deliberation. The next stage of the argument centered on the forensic record. The ballistic match between the .223 casing found in the trunk of Coler's car and the AR-15 recovered in the burned Kansas vehicle remained the cornerstone of the case. The prosecution reviewed each step of the forensic process. They explained how extractor marks arise from the unique wear patterns inside a firearm, how they are examined using comparative microscopy, and why they provide a reliable basis for identifying the weapon from which a casing was fired. The jury had already seen the enlarged photographs showing the matching patterns, but the prosecution reinforced that this was not subjective interpretation. It was measurable, demonstrable, and scientifically verified evidence that survived every level of judicial review. The prosecution then connected the ballistic evidence to subsequent investigative findings. The AR-15 recovered in Kansas was linked not only by the extractor markings, but also by its possession among Peltier's closest associates as they fled across multiple states. The weapon had been inside a vehicle containing numerous explosives and stolen firearms. Among the items in that debris field was Agent Coler's .308 rifle, further establishing the continuity of possession between the murder scene and the fugitive's flight. From Kansas, the prosecution moved to Oregon, where Agent Coler's stolen handgun had been discovered inside a bag under the seat of the RV. The fingerprint analysis, confirming Peltier's print on the bag, remained unchallenged. These factual elements repeated the same theme. The weapons taken from the agents did not disappear. They traveled with Peltier and those who assisted him. Eyewitness testimony received renewed attention. Michael Anderson's description of the sequence in which the Suburban arrived at the clearing, followed by the federal vehicles, established that the armed group positioned themselves in advance of the attack. Long Visitor's testimony confirmed that federal vehicles were unmistakable on Pine Ridge, eliminating any possibility that the agents had been mistaken for unknown armed individuals. Additional testimony from other witnesses placed Peltier in possession of the AR-15 before, during, and after the shootings. Each account had been selected during trial because it bore direct relevance to the central forensic narrative. Peltier had possessed the rifle that fired the fatal shots. The argument next shifted to the movements following the murders. The prosecution summarized the flight from Pine Ridge, the splitting of the group, the passage into surrounding states, the presence of weapons with obliterated serial numbers, and the increasing desperation of the suspects as they evaded law enforcement. Peltier's conduct during the Oregon traffic stop, emerging from the RV armed and firing at the trooper, reinforced the prosecution's position that he had been prepared to use lethal force when confronted. His heavily armed arrest in Canada, surrounded by multiple loaded weapons, further illustrated his awareness of the seriousness of the charges and his intention to resist. The prosecution closed its argument by emphasizing that the case did not rely on speculation, political interpretation, or broad social commentary. It rested on physical evidence, forensic certainty, documented recovery of stolen weapons, consistent witness testimony, and the uninterrupted sequence of possession and movement. The government argued that the evidence demonstrated beyond a reasonable doubt that Leonard Peltier had participated directly in the murders, and that the weapon linked to him through forensic examination had fired the close-range execution shots that ended the lives of agents Coler and Williams. The defense followed with its final argument, structured around the constraints imposed by the court's rulings. Without the ability to invoke broad narratives about historical grievances, they focused on challenging the government's evidence. Their strategy centered on raising questions about procedure, chain of custody, and the interpretation of witness testimony. They questioned the reliability of certain recollections due to the passage of time and the stress of events. They aimed to introduce doubt regarding who might have fired specific weapons. They attempted to argue that others present at the scene may have taken actions separate from Peltier. However, the defense did not present alternative forensic explanations capable of countering the ballistic match or the fingerprint evidence. The defense revisited arguments related to the involvement of multiple shooters. They questioned whether the forensic analysis could determine who fired each shot. They scrutinized the absence of eyewitness testimony, describing the specific moment when the close-range shots were delivered. They emphasized that the scene had included individuals from various locations and backgrounds, suggesting that the actions of others may have influenced the final outcome. Yet without the ability to contradict the forensic match between the casing and Peltier's AR-15, these arguments remained limited in impact. The defense also attempted to use procedural criticisms related to the extradition process, referencing the Poor Bear affidavits. They suggested that the inclusion of those affidavits demonstrated government misconduct, but because the affidavits had not been used at trial and Poor Bear had been deemed incompetent to testify, the relevance of these claims was minimal in the context of the courtroom. The prosecution had relied on independent forensic and physical evidence unrelated to the affidavits. As a result, these assertions did little to alter the jurors' perception of the factual components of the case. Once closing arguments concluded, the courtroom atmosphere changed. The focus shifted from presentation to deliberation. The sequestered jury received instructions outlining the legal standards for first-degree murder, the definition of aiding and abetting under federal law, and the criteria for evaluating evidence. They were informed that they must consider only the evidence introduced during the trial. The jury then exited the courtroom under supervision, leaving behind weeks of testimony and entering a private room where they would weigh the facts. Deliberations began under the same isolation that had defined the trial. Without access to media coverage or external commentary, jurors revisited the forensic photographs, ballistic comparisons, scene diagrams, and documentation presented throughout the case. Their discussions focused on the physical evidence, particularly the extractor markings on the .223 casing from the trunk. They examined the continuity between the Kansas explosion, the Oregon RV recovery, and the forensic chain that linked these events to the clearing on Pine Ridge. They also reviewed witness statements and examined how those accounts aligned with the forensic record. Hours passed as the jury continued its review. The nature of the evidence, rooted in science, physical recovery, and documented movements, provided a structured framework that did not depend on interpretation of motive or political context. The jury examined the fingerprint evidence on the bag found in the RV. They revisited the testimony, placing Peltier in possession of the AR-15 on the day of the murders. They evaluated the consistency of the forensic conclusions with the eyewitness descriptions of the scene. The deliberations reflected the gravity of the case and the responsibility placed upon them. When the jury reached its decision, the courtroom reconvened. Security remained firm, and the atmosphere carried the weight of the moment. The sequestered jurors entered the courtroom in measured silence. Their role in the process had reached its final point. The verdicts were read aloud, establishing that Leonard Peltier had been found guilty on 2 counts of first-degree murder for the deaths of Special Agents Jack R. Coler and Ronald A. Williams. The determination reflected the cumulative weight of forensic analysis, investigative continuity, eyewitness testimony, and the documented sequence of events following the confrontation. The next phase, sentencing, proceeded with the same formal gravity. Federal sentencing guidelines for first-degree murder during that period required life imprisonment. The court imposed 2 consecutive life terms, ensuring that the sentence reflected both murders individually, rather than collectively. The structure of consecutive sentencing underscored the federal recognition that each agent's death carried independent legal weight. The courtroom recorded the sentence in official proceedings, creating a permanent judicial entry that would influence subsequent parole decisions and appeals. Following sentencing, the judicial process transitioned into the initial phase of appeals. Peltier's legal team began preparing filings contesting the verdict, challenging the handling of evidence, and questioning procedural decisions. These appeals entered the federal system, progressing through magistrates, district courts, and circuit courts. Each judicial body reviewed the record meticulously. The decisions consistently upheld the conviction. One appellate judge, Gerald Heaney, examined the forensic and investigatory findings closely and reaffirmed that the extractor marks matched the AR-15 recovered in Kansas. His statement, later widely quoted, emphasized that despite the complexity of the case, the essential facts remained unchanged. The casing introduced into evidence had been extracted from the Wichita AR-15. As the appeals continued, Peltier's conviction moved deeper into judicial history. Federal courts repeatedly found that the evidence linking him to the murders remained conclusive. The Supreme Court declined to hear the case on multiple occasions. Subsequent filings, including habeas corpus petitions and motions for sentence reduction, followed similar paths. Judges reaffirmed that the forensic evidence had been properly admitted, that the structure of the trial had remained within constitutional bounds, and that the rulings concerning admissible testimony and trial procedure had been reasonable and legally sound. The verdict and sentencing phase marked a turning point in the overall trajectory of the case. The legal determination served as a formal recognition of the events reconstructed through months of investigation and weeks of trial. The courtroom proceedings had provided a structured examination of the evidence in a controlled environment, eliminating external noise and leaving only the factual record for evaluation. The decision established a judicial understanding of the murders that would guide every subsequent review, appeal, and petition. Outside the courtroom, the results reverberated across federal institutions. Williams and Coler were memorialized on the FBI's Wall of Honor. Their deaths continued to influence federal law enforcement training, operational caution, and policies regarding surveillance, defensive tactics, and pursuit protocols. The case became a reference point for discussions involving agent safety and the complexities of operating in politically unstable regions. Inside the justice system, the verdict became the anchor for all future legal actions related to the case. Each subsequent filing, whether involving parole, clemency petitions, or sentence modification requests, would return to the foundational facts established during trial: the ballistic match, the weapon recovery, the fingerprint evidence, the eyewitness accounts, and the documented movements of Peltier and his associates. Every legal authority reviewing the case would face the same evidentiary foundation, one that remained structurally intact across decades of judicial scrutiny. The sentencing marked the beginning of the long aftermath that would follow the trial. Years of appeals, petitions, statements from public officials, parole hearings, and ongoing legal debate. But in the courtroom, at that moment, the process reached its conclusion. The events that began in a remote clearing on Pine Ridge had moved through the full cycle of investigation, pursuit, apprehension, trial, and judicial determination. What remained was the record itself, preserved in transcripts, exhibits, forensic reports, and the formal verdict entered into the federal system. The transition from sentencing to the appellate phase represented a shift from the momentum of courtroom activity to the methodical, often painstaking pace of post-conviction litigation. Once Leonard Peltier entered the federal prison system, his legal team prepared the first series of challenges aimed at overturning the verdict or securing a new trial. The appeals process required an entirely different strategy from the trial itself. No new evidence could be introduced. No witnesses could be recalled. The appellate courts would examine only the existing record to determine whether legal errors had occurred that were substantial enough to invalidate the conviction. This environment placed enormous weight on the transcripts, exhibits, chain of custody documentation, forensic reports, and rulings made during the trial. Every detail became potential material for argument. The initial appeals raised questions concerning the extradition process, particularly the inclusion of Myrtle Pourbaix's affidavits. The defense argued that the affidavits had been coercively obtained and incorrectly portrayed as reliable evidence during extradition. However, the appellate courts examined the full record and concluded that the affidavits had not been used during the trial, nor had they influenced the presentation of evidence before the jury. The judges emphasized that the extradition decision rendered by Canadian courts rested on multiple factors, including the physical and forensic evidence the prosecution submitted. Because the affidavits had not entered the trial itself, their existence did not affect the fairness or validity of the proceedings. The appellate rulings confirmed that the trial had been conducted on the basis of admissible, independently verified evidence, separating the extradition concerns from the judicial process that followed. Next, the appeals focused on the ballistic evidence. The defense attempted to challenge the significance of the extractor mark comparison, arguing that it should have been considered less definitive. They also raised technical questions about the FBI laboratory's methodology. However, appellate judges reviewed the forensic record extensively. They reaffirmed that the .223 caliber casing found in the trunk of Coler's car had been matched to the AR-15 recovered in Kansas, and that this connection formed a central pillar of the case. The judges noted that the forensic analysis had been performed according to accepted standards, and that the defense had been given the opportunity to cross-examine the experts during trial. The appellate opinions emphasized that extractor marks provided a reliable, validated means of identification, and that inconsistent interpretations offered by the defense lacked scientific grounding. Judge Gerald Heaney who would later be frequently cited in public debates, reviewed the ballistic findings and affirmed that the match had been accurate and appropriately admitted. The defense's next argument centered on allegations of prosecutorial misconduct. They contended that the government had shifted theories during trial, presenting inconsistent narratives regarding Peltier's specific role in firing the fatal shots. The appellate courts addressed this by examining the statutory framework. Under Title 18, Section 2, aiding and abetting liability did not require the prosecution to prove that Peltier personally fired the fatal shots. It required only that he intentionally assisted or participated in the actions that resulted in the agent's deaths. The courts noted that the evidence supported both direct participation and aiding and abetting, reinforcing that the prosecution's approach had remained consistent under applicable law. Because the indictment and the jury instructions had matched the legal requirements precisely, the appellate courts found no conflict in the government's theory. Another component of the appeals focused on the conduct of the trial judge, specifically relating to restrictions placed on the defense. The defense argued that rulings limiting testimony about reservation conditions had hindered their ability to present a complete case. The appellate courts examined this claim. By evaluating the relevance of the excluded evidence, they determined that the trial judge had acted appropriately in restricting testimony that would have introduced broad social and political commentary unrelated to the factual question of guilt. The courts reaffirmed that the trial focused on specific actions taken on June 26, supported by specific forensic evidence, and that any attempt to widen the narrative would have introduced unnecessary distraction. The controlled environment of the trial had been deemed essential to ensuring a fair examination of the evidence. As the appeals moved into federal circuits, the defense introduced the issue of conflicting eyewitness accounts. They argued that inconsistencies among testimonies should have been given greater weight. The appellate courts reviewed the records and determined that while minor discrepancies existed, they did not undermine the core elements of the prosecution's case. The physical evidence, the ballistic match, the fingerprint on Agent Coler's handgun, and the documented movements of the suspects after the murders supplied a cohesive narrative that did not rely solely on eyewitness recollection. The courts concluded that the inconsistencies did not reach the level of reversible error. The next notable appeal involved newly raised claims about the FBI's handling of documents. The defense argued that certain ballistic test results, specifically the Wichita casing memorandum, had not been disclosed properly. The appellate review revealed that, while the memorandum referenced test results, showing that a bullet recovered near the agent's bodies was not fired from Peltier's AR-15, the prosecution had not relied on that bullet in any part of its case. The prosecution had consistently based its ballistic argument on the 223 casing found in the trunk of Coler's car, not on any bullet fragment fired from long range. The courts ruled that the undisclosed memorandum did not affect the outcome because it concerned evidence the prosecution had never used and that had not played any role in establishing guilt. The judgment highlighted that the critical extractor match remained completely intact. Another appellate argument challenged the jurisdiction of the trial venue, asserting that the trial should have been conducted in a location closer to Pine Ridge. The courts reaffirmed that venue selection had been appropriate due to the volatile atmosphere surrounding the reservation at the time, the need for a neutral jury pool, and the practical realities of ensuring procedural order. Fargo had been selected specifically to prevent conflicts, and the appellate courts maintained that this decision fell squarely within judicial discretion. As appeals continued into the late 1970s and early 1980s, the courts repeatedly upheld the conviction. Each motion addressed different dimensions of the trial: evidentiary rulings, jury instructions, venue selection, extradition issues, forensic procedures, and alleged misconduct. None of the legal challenges undermined the structural integrity of the case. The appellate opinions became increasingly detailed, with multiple judges addressing each component of the record. The consistency of these rulings strengthened the judiciary's position that the conviction rested on unassailable evidence. The legal landscape surrounding the case solidified. As the appeals progressed into the 1990s, the legal strategy shifted, entering the realm of parole eligibility and clemency petitions. While no longer directly tied to the guilt phase, these efforts depended heavily on the established judicial findings. The Parole Commission, reviewing the case through the lens of sentencing guidelines and statutory requirements, referred repeatedly to the trial record. Statements from commissioners emphasized the severity of the crimes, the nature of the evidence, and the lack of mitigating factors that would justify early release. Parole hearings became procedural extensions of the original verdict, with reviewers returning consistently to the forensic conclusions that had been upheld repeatedly. Clemency petitions, submitted to various presidential administrations, encountered similar barriers. Executive offices reviewed the formal record, the judicial opinions, and statements from federal law enforcement. Because the underlying facts had survived decades of appeals, the petitions faced an evidentiary foundation that remained intact and legally validated. Recommendations from the Department of Justice, citing the nature of the crime and the judicial findings, consistently opposed clemency. Across successive administrations, the petitions did not meet the threshold for reconsidering the sentence. During this period, public discourse surrounding the case began to diverge sharply from the legal landscape. Supporters of Peltier framed the case as representative of broader political struggles on Pine Ridge and issues involving federal authority. They circulated interpretations that challenged aspects of the investigation, often focusing on ancillary details rather than the forensic core. The appeals courts, however, addressed only the legal record and the documented chain of evidence. As public commentary expanded, the judicial stance remained firmly tethered to the trial proceedings and the structured appellate decisions that followed. By the early 2000s, multiple judicial reviews had reaffirmed every substantial component of the case. Habeas corpus petitions filed during this era were examined with the same level of scrutiny as earlier appeals. The courts reiterated that claims involving new interpretations of evidence or reinterpretations of witness statements did not meet the legal criteria for relief. They affirmed that the trial had met constitutional standards and that the conviction rested on reliable physical and forensic evidence. The appellate courts maintained that the case had been tried fairly and that the rulings challenged by the defense fell within the permissible range of judicial discretion. As the decades advanced, Peltier's health and age entered discussions surrounding parole and clemency. But the legal foundation of the case did not change. Parole reviews continued to cite the seriousness of the offense and the statutory requirements governing murder of federal officers. Clemency petitions continued to face opposition, grounded in the forensic findings and the judicial record. The appeals process, which had begun immediately after sentencing, evolved into a long-term cycle of legal filings, reviews and denials, reflecting both the severity of the crime and the strength of the evidence that supported the conviction. The long appeals phase demonstrated the endurance of the original trial record. Across multiple courts, decades, and legal frameworks, the findings held. The extractor match between the .223 casing in Coler's trunk and the AR-15 recovered in Kansas remained central. The fingerprint on Agent Coler's handgun remained unchallenged. The eyewitness testimony placing Peltier at the scene remained consistent with the physical and forensic evidence. The courts repeatedly emphasized that while the case held political resonance for some, the judicial record rested on scientific and evidentiary foundations that met legal standards across every level of review. As the appellate history accumulated, each decision added another layer to the institutional recognition of the case's validity. The judiciary's reaffirmation across decades provided a stabilizing force in the broader public conversation. While external debates continued in academic forums, political circles, and media portrayals, the legal record remained unchanged. The courts had examined the evidence in multiple contexts: procedural, constitutional, forensic, and statutory, and reached the same conclusion each time. By the time the appeals phase extended into its fourth and fifth decades, the case had become one of the longest and most thoroughly reviewed federal convictions of the era. The appellate courts, parole boards, and executive offices shared a consistent interpretation grounded in the trial record. What began as a violent confrontation in a remote clearing on Pine Ridge had expanded into a far-reaching legal history that traversed generations of judges, attorneys, investigators, and public officials. Each review reaffirmed the foundation laid in the courtroom, preserving the structure of the case and ensuring that its legal standing remained intact. The progression into the final stage of the case unfolded against nearly 5 decades of legal battles, political debates, and repeated reviews across multiple branches of the U.S. government. By this period, the narrative surrounding Leonard Peltier had accumulated layers of public interpretation, advocacy messaging, and historical distance. Yet the legal system continued to measure the case by its original evidentiary record. The transition into the last major decision point began with a series of petitions, evaluations, and administrative reviews that re-examined the case through the lens of current policy, federal guidelines, and the realities of an aging inmate serving consecutive life sentences. Years of parole denials had established a consistent pattern. Each review returned to the same foundational principles: the gravity of the crime, the death of 2 federal agents in the line of duty, and the affirmed findings of the trial court and appellate courts. The legal parameters governing the murders of federal officers left little room for discretionary early release. The parole commissions repeatedly cited the nature of the offense as a defining factor that outweighed mitigating considerations. As Peltier's age advanced, requests for reconsideration framed the discussion around humanitarian grounds. But the commissions continued to reference statutory obligations and the judicial findings that had remained unbroken since 1977. At the same time, federal agencies responsible for reviewing clemency requests faced the responsibility of balancing humanitarian appeals against the institutional memory of the case. Memoranda circulated through the Department of Justice engaged directly with the factual history. They reviewed the ballistic evidence, the eyewitness accounts, the fingerprint findings, the circumstances surrounding Peltier's flight from law enforcement, and the sequence of appeals that had followed. The internal analyses reaffirmed that the conviction had withstood decades of scrutiny, and the agencies tasked with making recommendations consistently advised federal administrations that the case did not meet the criteria for clemency or early release. The weight of the case extended far beyond its legal dimension. The murders of agents Jack Coler and Ronald Williams remain defining moments in FBI history. The memory of the events, the brutality of the final shots, and the scope of the gunfire directed at responding officers created a sense of institutional permanence around the case. Statements from federal officials across multiple decades reflected this position. Evaluations by successive FBI directors consistently framed the case in terms of duty, sacrifice, and the precedent set for law enforcement response to lethal violence. This institutional perspective carried significant influence in the clemency review process, shaping the context in which federal decision-makers evaluated petitions. Over time, appeals for release grew more frequent, often accompanied by public campaigns organized by advocacy groups. These efforts highlighted concerns about the length of incarceration, the passage of time, and the ongoing debate about reservation politics during the 1970s. They circulated alternate interpretations of the case, centered on broader political themes, rather than the detailed forensic evidence presented at trial. However, federal legal bodies consistently returned to the foundational record, distinguishing public narratives from judicially recognized fact. The courts, parole commissions, and executive review offices all relied on the certified transcripts, exhibits, and findings that had been validated through extensive review. By the early 2020s, Peltier's health had become a significant component of petitions for reconsideration. Medical assessments documented chronic conditions associated with aging inmates in long-term confinement. Supporters argued for humanitarian release or commutation based on the diminishing threat posed by an elderly prisoner with declining health. However, the legal system continued to weigh these considerations against the statutory guidelines governing the murders of federal agents and the position of the agencies most directly affected by the case. In multiple statements, federal officials emphasized that the severity of the crimes remained unchanged by the passage of time. The petitions submitted during this period included extensive documentation, ranging from medical reports to historical summaries and statements from supporters. Reviewers evaluated each submission through established procedures. The Department of Justice's Office of the Pardon Attorney reviewed the record, examining both the content of the petitions and the history of appellate rulings. While humanitarian grounds were considered, the office's recommendations continued to reflect the long-standing view that the evidence supporting the conviction remained conclusive. Internal reviews repeatedly cited the ballistic match between the .223 casing in Agent Coler's trunk and the AR-15 recovered in Kansas, the fingerprint found on Agent Coler's handgun, the physical evidence from the crime scene, and the documented actions following the murders. The turning point emerged not from a re-examination of guilt, but from a shift in federal policy toward the management of aging inmates. Across the federal prison system, new frameworks for compassionate release and home confinement began to develop. These frameworks acknowledged the practical and humanitarian considerations involved in incarcerating elderly prisoners with significant medical needs. They also reflected broader administrative approaches to criminal justice management. Over time, the discussions surrounding Peltier's case increasingly intersected with these evolving policies. The considerations did not alter the legal findings, but influenced the administrative decisions concerning the conditions of confinement. Federal officials responsible for security assessments evaluated the risk posed by transferring an elderly inmate from a maximum security environment to supervised home confinement. Their assessments acknowledged that the risk associated with escape or violent reoffending had declined sharply with age and medical deterioration. Reports documented the practical realities of supervising home confinement through modern monitoring technologies, contrasting the operational demands of long-term incarceration with the administrative efficiency of supervised release under strict conditions. While these assessments informed the discussion, the final decision required presidential approval. The petition reviewed by the administration contained decades of legal history, judicial rulings, and agency statements. It also included recent medical evaluations and references to federal policies related to aging inmates. The decision-making process involved a multi-layered review, integrating legal, administrative, humanitarian, and policy considerations. The administration examined the full record, acknowledging the long history of judicial affirmation, while also weighing the present circumstances of confinement. The final decision reflected a balance between two immovable realities. First, the legal system had determined beyond reasonable doubt that Peltier participated in the murders of 2 federal agents, and that the forensic evidence linking him to the close-range shots had been upheld through every appellate review. Second, the realities of advanced age and declining health presented a humanitarian dimension that was distinct from the question of guilt. The administration elected to commute the remainder of Peltier's sentence so that it would be served under home confinement rather than within a federal penitentiary. The commutation did not overturn the conviction, question the findings of the trial, or alter the historical record. It adjusted only the conditions of imprisonment. The announcement generated immediate reactions from numerous circles within federal law enforcement. The decision was received with solemn acknowledgement. Statements from leadership emphasized that the commutation did not alter the legal or factual understanding of the murders. They reiterated the significance of the case as part of the institutional memory of the Bureau, reaffirming the sacrifices of agents Coler and Williams. They acknowledged the humanitarian basis for the change, while underscoring that the conviction stood fully intact. Public responses reflected the long-standing divide surrounding the case. Advocates for Peltier framed the commutation as a humanitarian measure long overdue, focusing on his age and health rather than the legal findings. Critics questioned the appropriateness of altering the conditions of confinement for someone convicted of killing federal agents. Media coverage revisited the history of the case, producing summaries that varied widely in detail and accuracy. Throughout this public discourse, the legal record remained unchanged, anchored in the exhaustive process of trial, appeal, and judicial review. Within the federal prison system, the logistics of transition were handled with procedural precision. Coordination between federal agencies ensured that monitoring equipment, supervision arrangements, medical care, and housing requirements met the standards required for home confinement. The transfer required clear documentation regarding restrictions, oversight protocols, and compliance monitoring. Each step was reviewed by supervisory officials to ensure that the conditions followed the guidelines established under federal policy. The transition itself, though administrative, marked a historical moment. A case that had stretched nearly half a century from the gunfire on Pine Ridge reached a new phase, not through legal reversal, but through humanitarian policy. The legal findings, reinforced repeatedly over decades, remained intact. The forensic evidence continued to stand as the central element of the case. The appellate rulings retained their authority, but the manner of confinement shifted, reflecting the federal government's acknowledgement of humanitarian considerations within the broader context of modern criminal justice administration. This final decision did not resolve the public debate surrounding the case. Those discussions continued in academic circles, documentaries, advocacy groups, and political forums. But within the legal system, the decision represented the final major administrative action. It clarified that the commutation did not alter guilt, overturn conviction, or introduce new legal interpretations. It simply recognized the practical and humanitarian realities of incarcerating an elderly inmate whose health had deteriorated significantly. The case had begun with gunfire in a remote canyon on Pine Ridge, leading to intense firefight, 2 deaths, and a national manhunt. It evolved into one of the most extensively litigated federal cases in modern history. It traversed decades of appeals, hearings, reviews, and denials. It became the subject of political activism, cultural commentary, and institutional reflection. Throughout this long history, the central elements remained constant. The evidence collected from the crime scene, the forensic match of the .223 casing, the fingerprint on Agent Coler's handgun, and the sequence of events documented by investigators and witnesses. The final decision marked the end of one phase and the beginning of another, but it did so without altering the foundation of the case. Peltier remained convicted of the murders of agents Coler and Williams. The evidence supporting the conviction remained unchallenged by the judiciary. The commutation of sentence to home confinement acknowledged only the realities of age and health. The case, in its full legal form, closed not with a reversal, but with an administrative adjustment rooted in humanitarian considerations. Like, share, and subscribe to stay with the mystery crime for new cases.